Every year, at the World Science Fiction Convention, the Hugo Awards are given out for the best in science fiction and fantasy from the previous year. Now, these sorts of awards should be taken with a pinch of salt. Of course, a book that wins a Hugo for Best Novel is just the same thing as a movie that wins an Oscar for Best Picture. It might be the best thing that year, but it might also just be the most popular and most hyped thing that year, or it might be the most culturally palatable thing that year. However, when I was growing up, I remember turning to the Hugos or the Nebulas or whatever it was for guidance. There's a lot of stuff that comes out every year and you can't read it all, and the people who are deciding who gets nominated and who wins, well, they're just science fiction and fantasy nerds like me, right? So whatever they deem to be the best thing of the year, surely that's as good a place to start as any. And you know what? I don't remember being disappointed very often. Kim Stanley Robinson, George R.R. Martin, John Scalzi, Ursula K. Le Guin, all writers I discovered through their Hugo nominations. And that's a pretty impressive list, like maybe some of the best to ever do it. So maybe there's something in this award stuff. However, in recent years I have been a bit critical of the Hugos and awards like it. I think there has been a decline in quality. I think the books that have won over the past few years can't hold a candle to the books that have won in years past, you know? But am I wrong? Are these the rose-tinted spectacles of my youth? Well, in this series in which I go and I read and I deep dive into every novel that's won a Hugo, I intend to find out. Starting with the very first Hugo Award given for Best Novel, The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. Bester was once described by Harry Harrison as one of the handful of writers who invented modern science fiction, and indeed by the time he collected his inaugural Hugo Award, he'd already been publishing successful science fiction stories for the better part of 15 years. His first story, The Broken Axiom, appeared in Thrilling Wonder Stories in 1939, and he later went on to publish many stories in the premier sci-fi mag at the time, John W. Campbell's legendary Astounding Science Fiction. He didn't just write for short story magazines, though. He also had a brief stint at DC Comics where, get this, he invented the character Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, and wrote what we know today as the Green Lantern Oath. You know the one, in Brightest Day and Blackest Night. Yeah, that was Bester. So it is fair to say that when it came time to give out that first ever Hugo Award for Best Novel, Bester was already held in quite high regard amongst his peers. Bester stopped writing for Astounding in the late 50s, apparently due to Campbell's newfound preoccupation with L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics. I think the less said about that the better. And then he started selling stories to Galaxy Science Fiction instead, which, under its editor H.L. Gold, was rapidly growing in popularity. And it is at Galaxy Magazine, at around this time, that Bester would serialize The Demolished Man. One thing I think is important to note here is that at this time, a lot of the successful stories that ended up as novels were in fact serials. There are reasons for this stemming from sci-fi and fantasy's pulp origins, but suffice it to say that the genre paperback had not really taken off yet, not in the way that it would do very, very soon. So, The Demolished Man was published in 1952 in the January, February, and March editions of Galaxy Magazine. The story follows Ben Reich, who is the head of Monarch, one of the largest corporations in the galaxy. Reich decides that he needs to murder his bitter rival, Cray de Courtney, in order to take over his company, become the most powerful man in the world, but also to rid himself of these nightmares he's been having about a man with no face. The first part of the book deals with plotting and carrying out de Courtney's murder. In the second act, a police detective called Lincoln Powell is assigned to the case. Powell figures out quickly, using his psionic abilities, that Reich is the killer, but doesn't have the evidence to prove it. What follows is a classic cat-and-mouse game where the wits of the detective versus the wits of the mastermind killer are pitted against one another. The book heavily explores the concept of espers, or peepers as they're often referred in the book. These are people with psionic abilities that can peep into someone's mind, and the better a peeper they are, the higher level, the deeper in they can go, all the way to the subconscious. This was a very common trope in sci-fi at the time, owing perhaps to a post-war era where psychological conditions and psychotherapy were for the first time being brought to the forefront of people's imaginations. But also, I think people genuinely believed that psionic abilities were an option for the future, whether it be like technologically or even evolutionary. It could be an evolution of empathy or instinct or the mysterious sixth sense. In any case, psionic abilities play an integral role in the plot of this story. Like, part of the fun of the plot is, how do you plan, execute, and get away with a murder when there are people around you all the time that can peer into your mind? It's pretty intriguing stuff. In the third act, with Powell closing in, Reich becomes increasingly erratic and deranged. He descends into spirals of madness as he attempts to save himself. The book becomes more and more cerebral and less procedural as a result. The Demolished Man was a hit with fans of the genre and with Bester's peers. It consistently reviewed really well. Science Fiction and Fantasy magazine called it a masterful compounding of science and detective fiction. And Groff Conklin, who is A, contender maybe for one of the best names of all time, and B, admittedly writing in the very same magazine that Demolished Man was published in, had this to say. Among other things, this is as fascinating a study of character as I have ever read. Ben Reich, owner of the second most powerful business monopoly in the solar system, ruthless murderer and bitterly tortured soul, is an unforgettably vivid personality. And for me, I tend to agree with them. From the introduction of Reich's character, exploring his neuroses, his external issues, from the excellently built and plotted murder sequence, to the 50s centric vision of the future, and all the quirky technological ideas that come along with that. Yes, this book is 70 years old at this point, and because of that, it does come along with some of the trappings of the past. Don't expect women to do much in this story except for fawn over literally any man they're in a scene with. And don't expect any mystery in the finale. In fact, expect every element of it to be laid out for you in crippling detail. Actually, I happen to think if the book had just ended a chapter sooner, it would have been way better. But I can't begrudge it these things. I mean, you read a novel like this, you know what you're getting into. It comes with the territory. It's fine. Get over it. Having said that, for a novel written in the early 50s, it's actually quite modern. It has a lot of ideas that are quite modern. We haven't even talked about some of the experiments in form that Bester gets into. Like here, where Bester uses typographic and formatting techniques to display the thought patterns of the peepers. Or the way he stylizes some of the names, like Atkins, Wigand, and Quatermain. There really is a feeling of ingenuity here, a creative force that runs through the whole thing, giving it a sense of wonder, the kind of wonder and possibility that all science fiction, I think, should strive for. Join me next week for They'd Rather Be Right or The Forever Machine by Mark Clifton and Frank Riley. Thanks for watching, and you right there, you watching this right now, could you be my first subscriber? Maybe.